Great. All right, we're now being recorded. Thank you all very much for coming. Welcome. Whoops, I'm ahead of myself. Now we're recording. Thank you all, everybody, for coming. This is a working group meeting on the 12 FAR residential cap. It's a perennial topic. It's come through the Chelsea Land Use Committee, the Hell's Kitchen Land Use Committee, HHS Committee multiple times. This working group was formed to see if we can't sift through a lot of the information. This is a very dense topic, and see if we can't reach some sort of position for the board to take on residential density. This is a follow-up to a many series of meetings. On the 17th, we had a panel discussion with a urban planner suggested by the preservation activists. We had somebody who was formerly on CB4 and on the Planning Commission, and we also had somebody who has worked in the community to build affordable housing. From that conversation, at our last meeting, we decided to tackle three major topics. One is the economics of converting commercial spaces into residential. The second is to talk about the allowance for higher density residential in existing high density areas, such as Hudson Yards North. And the third topic would be to see how we can integrate higher density housing into the CB's current housing plan. So the effort is to try to keep all of these conversations in bite-sized pieces so that we can dig into them a little deeper. And so today's agenda is specifically to talk about commercial conversion to residential. And so we've invited Frank Fish to come speak with us. He's an urban planner currently working with the Garment District Alliance. As board members are aware, the Garment District Alliance is thinking about putting together a zoning text amendment to allow some of their high vacancy buildings, and notably the commercial buildings in the Garment District, to be converted to residential. The board has taken a position on that and sent recommendations to the Garment District Alliance. That letter is in Dropbox for committee members to review so that we have an understanding of where we are with that. Although this is not technically a standing committee of the community board, I'd like to follow the same protocol. We'll have a presentation, we'll have some conversation amongst the working group members. Once working group members have had an opportunity to dig into these issues as deeply as they want, we'll open up for public comments, and I will give privilege to the community board members present to speak first, and then other members of the community speak after that. Keeping in mind that this meeting is scheduled from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. So let's try to keep it singularly focused on commercial conversion and respect all of our time when everybody has other things to be doing besides volunteering for this. So with that, I'd like to start with introducing the working group members present. Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I'm the co-chair of Chelsea Land Use.
David.
Solnick. I'm on CB4, obviously, and I'm on both the transportation and the Clinton land use committees.
Thank you, David. And Lowell.
I am Lowell Kern. I am here by virtue of my membership on Chelsea Land Use.
I think Roberta's here too.
I just saw Roberta come in. Roberta, you're at introduction stage. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciated. Hi, my name is Roberta Barnett. I'm a member of the Housing, Health, and Human Services Committee of CB4.
Thanks, Bob. Brad Pescarella and Viren Bernhardt are also members of this working group. I know Viren is not able to attend today, but if Brad comes in later, I may interrupt just so he has the opportunity to introduce himself. All right, with introductions done then, I'd like to get started with Frank Fish, if we could. Frank, we have talked briefly by email about the topics for today in commercial conversions. You've been present at community board meetings on our zoning text amendment discussions. So I kind of want to have a little dialogue with you about three main topics. What are the sort of physical constraints of commercial conversions to residential? What are some of the economic constraints? And what are some of the political constraints? So if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick minute of who you are and why you care about this.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, my name is Frank Fish, and I'm a principal of BFJ Planning. Very briefly, we were founded in 1980. I was one of the founding partners, and we've been at work in the city and its suburbs since that time. And a lot of it has involved, New York City developments, work for community boards, 197A and C plans, commentary on city planning, zoning initiatives. So we're generally familiar with, different aspects of the code, different aspects of, plans that the city has done. But most recently, and so probably relevant here is, and I think you're probably all, because you've written a letter of, I think I could describe it as general support for the Garment District study, the BID study. And we prepared that study for them, suggesting that, that conversions in the Garment District to residential was something that could improve the district. We did identify some issues, and Paul, you've identified 3 different subject matters there: the physical constraints, the economic issues, and the political issues with it. The physical ones are not, I think they depend a bit on the site. We went through different sites as part of the Garment District study with an architect. We share space, by the way, with Perkins Eastman Architects, who's one of the larger, architectural firms in New York. And one of their architects, Robert Marino, has worked on a half dozen or more residential, conversions of older buildings, some down here in the general Flatiron District where our office is located, and then in other parts of the city. But I think its physical constraints depend very much on the building. Some buildings, particularly if it's a freestanding sort of the old wedding cake building, then you've got the ability for a residential conversion that becomes attractive particularly on the upper floors, where you have those setbacks and you have the ability to have light and air. Some buildings don't have that. And if you don't, you're talking about large floor plates, very hard to get light and air in the center of those floor plates. So it depends very much physically on the building's sort of size, floor plate size, where the elevators are. Are there 2 sets of elevators? And some of these, I was looking at, we were looking at the Garment District. So there's 2 sets of elevators, one that can be used for lower floors that might be a mix of uses, retail, office, but a separate set for residential. It makes that conversion easier. And in a wedding cake building, it makes it more feasible, and to get, for a developer, good prices on those higher floors, which have, light and air and the best views. So the physical is what we also found in looking at some comps. And this gets now into economic, is those physical costs can be such that without some form of a 421G, let's say, program, for some buildings, that's going to be very difficult to make the financial pro forma work. And I think we're all, I think most people were, let's put it this way, most of the development community that I'm familiar with were somewhat disappointed with the governor's housing compact proposals had in it the idea of continuing some type of tax credit or tax abatement to conversions. Basically, as you know, the compact has not been, and my understanding of it from the groups we're members of in Albany are that both the legislative houses, the Assembly and the Senate, just wouldn't go along with it, and the governor has postponed the whole thing to a normal legislative session without, addressing it in the budget. So one of the things we did say in the Garment District is, first we needed to open the door on residential conversions with zoning. It seemed to us that that was something that is a is a winner, actually, both for the city, given the mayor's initiatives and given where city planning is. And so that we met, as you know, with that, with both councilmen, with the borough president. And I think the only negative response we got was, quite frankly, from the former borough president. But the current borough president is in favor of this. So the political sense that I get is that there's a favorable reaction to those that we met with to residential conversions. One of the councilmen said to us that it has a certain attractiveness in that it doesn't generally, now this is in the garment district where we're looking at buildings that have a high, significant vacancy rate, that it doesn't necessarily lead to residential displacement on any significant order of magnitude, something that the city council's been recently, concerned about. So there seems to be that support politically for residential conversions. So I know I haven't, covered maybe in detail those three areas, but the other area that we've been involved with is this residential FAR 12. And some of our, not-for-profits or civic organizations we've worked with, like Civitas, and in the Upper East Side, it's been Friends of the Upper East Side, and in the Upper West Side, it's been, the Upper West Side organizations who are generally very wary, and I would add into that the Landmarks Conservancy, very wary, I would say outright opposed to lifting FAR 12. However, I think there's also obviously some desire to do that. And if you do that, I think an argument for it, and I realize that there's some arguments out there from others that say, look, just raising the FAR 12 is not going to really produce affordable housing. But I think it could, if the only way you can raise it is to produce affordable housing. What I'm getting at is the old inclusionary zoning that the city had in place, still has in place, for instance, on the Upper East Side. You can go from a 10 to 12 FAR if you do what they called inclusionary housing. It wasn't highly used, and some people in our office feel maybe the FAR bonus wasn't quite high enough, or maybe the process at city planning was burdensome. However, if the only way to get above the FAR cap, say to go to FAR 15 or 16, I'm just throwing that out as a number, was to actually do affordable housing, then I think the development community would respond, because that FAR bonus could be very, very attractive to them.
Right.
So, just a thought.
I appreciate that, Frank. I do want us to try to stay a little bit honed in on just the commercial conversion component, because given it, but within that context, right? Because many of you are focused in on the garment district, but we have other commercial buildings in our community board district that are overbuilt, they're greater than 12 FAR. Right. So if we were to do commercial conversion of overbuilt buildings, that would be housing density greater than 12. So I want to just really hone in a little bit more on just the conversion of existing commercial spaces, and not go off too far onto Upper East Side's 12 FAR issues. So given that, one of the things you just mentioned on the economic perspective is that without a 421G or other tax abatements, you don't see it as feasible. Can you explain that a little bit further? Like, what are the costs associated? Why is it that these buildings could be built as commercial buildings, but now that you're saying it wouldn't be economically feasible to convert them to residential, and that would have to rely on tax abatements to do that? So does that question make some sense?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I would say that makes sense. And as I was saying, I think it depends. I don't want to make a blanket statement. It does depend on the building. In some circumstances, You might have a situation where, someone's got a basis point in a building that's very low. They've had it for a long time. They're going to act as developer. That's a different situation where they can afford to do the building, perhaps a conversion without, that tax abatement of some type, particularly where they can get extra floor space. Because if the building is overbuilt, effectively you can use it. You can use that floor space that is above the maximum FAR under the current regulations of the city. So that's where there's a certain beauty to the conversion. In other words, actually the FAR 12 there, by providing a limit, the only way to get around, or one of the ways around that limit, is to convert a building that's overbuilt. And you have a right to do that. You can do that through the city planning process. So it does depend. I mean, there's some buildings that are significantly, actually a lot of buildings in the Garment District and probably your whole area, given when they were built, are over FAR 12 is what our analysis showed. So in those cases, that's very attractive to a developer, particularly someone who might have owned it, but someone who's buying it new from, say, an existing property owner. They've got to do their own financial pro forma. They've got to buy it. They're going to be buying it in a different atmosphere. In other words, an atmosphere which I think they would only act on if they really felt the city is going to move forward on, first, the zoning, the residential zoning, to allow residential in the first place, because the office market is largely dormant right now. It's not a good market, as I think most people recognize. So first, there's got to be that door opening of the zoning in terms of allowing it. But if it were opened, that will also affect the sales price. So there's going to be there's going to be a new applicant, a new developer is, I think, going to look for, if he's got a building that's a wedding cake, he's over the FAR, he can maximize the FAR with light and air, and he's got elevator shafts which he can reutilize. He's not forced into major structural changes. He might be able to do it without tax abatement. However, on many buildings, that won't be the case. That's what the financial district downtown showed us anyway, that when they had the 421G in place, there were a number of conversions. When they didn't have it in place, they dropped off significantly. So I don't want to make a blanket, you know what I mean, Paul? I don't want to make a blanket statement that you must have tax abatement of some type. I think it depends on the structure of the ownership, who's developing, what's the basis point which you're doing the financial pro forma on. So it might vary building by building or case by case. But
Right.
If you look at the past, a lot of the conversions have been based in the financial district, say, on that old 421G.
Great. Thanks, Frank. I see Brad Pascarella is here now and has his hand raised. So Brad, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Is DOB and the city looking at changing the requirements so these changes structurally do not have to happen like a railroad apartment? Meaning the bedroom doesn't need a window, like a lot of the rest of the country. I'm just wondering if that's being looked at, which would significantly bring down the costs and get these things rolling. Because we have sprinkler, we have all the life safety issues there that are part of the component of the drawings, but the real issue is those windows and then reconfiguring the space. So is that being looked at?
I have to say, I don't know that city planning's focused there right now. As you know, under the current regs, my understanding is that you can do, let's take a situation where you are overbuilt, the building's into rear yard setbacks. You can, depends on a labeling process by the architect. I mean, you might not be able to label certain rooms as a bedroom, but they might end up being used that way. I mean, the city knows that under the rules now in the multiple dwelling code and the conversions, it allows you to some flexibility. But in answer to your question, Brad, I'm not aware. I mean, we've only met with city planning. We haven't met with the building department on this. Their focus, I think, is more on the mayor's rezoning initiative than on that issue of relaxing building code standards for the conversions. Although I have to say, because we haven't gone into that time, we haven't asked that specific question of them.
I mean, my thought process is you're going to change the zoning. And if we don't look at what's being accepted there as part of that plan, it doesn't really make any sense. Because if it's affordable housing and the subsidy is going to pay for a 1-bedroom, but it's really a 2-bedroom, they can't just say, oh, we know it's a bedroom. We have to be kind of clear so then the developers can plan for it. And we're trying to bring down the cost so we could have the affordable housing. So I think it's something should be part of the discussion earlier than later.
I see. Right.
Thanks, Brad. Roberta?
Thank you for this. I wanted to ask specifically if you had an idea of what the city was thinking about doing in terms of its own efforts to facilitate commercial conversions. Are they considering like a zoning text amendment that would enable commercial conversions in a similar way that the state's the governor's proposal would have? Is there some other proposal that the city's pursuing, and what does that look like? Does it have a public input process? I'm curious.
Well, it will. What the city's talked about, and we've met with the chair of city planning, is to, our proposal, as you know, in the garment district was to allow residential and to allow it by a text change, and in the garment district itself, and then in some other areas by a mapping change. However, both of those under current law, and I think the city's not looking at anything but current law, they would need a ULURP process. And that would involve, by definition, public involvement, including the community board 4 or board 5, whatever board it's in. So public involvement would be involved right away, because both the text change and the mapping, certainly the mapping is a ULURP process. There's some debate about whether you made a text change and it's by authorization of the city planning commissioner, whether that's an as of right or not. But I think what we talked to them about was either at a minimum would be an EAS, an environmental assessment statement, to get into ULURP. But in answer to your question, in any way they did it, either the EAS or the EIS, it's a ULURP requirement. So public participation would be involved, and a public hearing.
And then just one follow-up. Do you know what the age of the buildings in the garment district are for conversion? Only because I think that relates to what the state allows in terms of the age there.
Yeah, quite frankly, I'd have to look at our report. We've got some of that information in our report, but a lot of these buildings, they're quite, they're older than, they're 30, 40, 50 years old. These are buildings that are pre-61, the 61 zoning code amendments of the city. So these are basically more older buildings.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Roberta. Gregory, as I said at the outset of the meeting, I'm going to have working group members have a conversation first, and when that's exhausted, I'll call on public after. So I see your hand, but I'm going to hold off on calling on you. Greg, I have a few follow-up questions on what you were just talking about, and going back to the economics of this. Can you explain to the work group and to the public the notion of a basis points? Like you had mentioned that somebody may have a low enough basis that they could afford to do this, whereas somebody new coming in may not. Can you give a little bit of an explanation?
I mean, someone who's owned, we met with a few, property owners. It depends on what their you know, I'll give you a case where someone has owned the building for 25 years. They're not in this to not, you know, necessarily make a huge profit or, you know, turn it around, but they're in it for their family situation. They see an opportunity on the residential conversion if that, you know, if the city can get that through in terms of zoning. They may be looking for a long-term, they may be looking for a rental situation where there's long-term income coming in. And their requirement for profit and also for bank financing may be slightly different than a developer who's new. In other words, their basis point and their expectations on what kind of return on money that they're going to get may be lower than what a developer has coming in new on it. So we find there's some situations like that where, you know, someone's owned the building and they're going to co-develop it with someone. Their expectations may be a little bit different than the Extels of the city, who are going to, you know, they're going to look to a bank finance. The rates are higher. The expectations of what they can bring in on the building are going to be higher in terms of the return.
If I could now follow up with a little bit more about on that theme, the return for the investments is really what we're looking at now. So what about the mix of affordability and market rate units? Can you talk a little bit about the impact of having MIH requirements of a 30% affordable mix in a conversion of a commercial building? How does that impact the economics?
Yeah, we ran this a few years ago with Penske is now with RXR, and Penske's now left them and is the man we ran these with is now at the Upper East Side Y, I think. But we ran some you know, financials with them, and what it showed is that the affordable housing units, and it depends on both the what level are we talking about? Are we talking about 80% of median income? You know, that kind of thing. If we are, I mean, that's a normal one to talk about. And if you're talking about anything much more than 10% of the building being affordable, you're getting into significant costs to the developer. You know, the cost of the affordable unit is the cost of building is not substantially different with the affordable unit than it is with the market rate unit. They're basically the same unit. They're basically, now the finishings might be somewhat different, but that's
not here at MCB4.
yeah, you want the finishings the same, right?
Uh-huh.
And we've had developers tell us it's not worth it in some cases to try to do different finishings anyway. They want to, but what they have told us is, and I'll just cite the RXR example in doing residential buildings, that they would rather do some other amenities to the building, open space amenities, that affordable housing, depending on how it's structured, is very expensive for them to provide because they're losing money on the unit. They can't cover the construction costs and the development costs of the unit. So what they're trying to do is cross-subsidize, unless they have an outside source of income, such as a subsidy of some sort, or a density bonus, they need to cross-subsidize that unit. The unit has to be subsidized by someone, and either through density, through outside sources on the affordable units, or it's not feasible for them. Now, on a lot of buildings, they can afford up to 10%. But to go to 30%, some of these higher ratios is very, very difficult to do because that affordable unit costs the same amount to build, essentially, as a market rate unit. So those market rate units are subsidizing the affordable unit, in essence. By the way, I don't want you to think I'm at all arguing here against affordability or affordable units. It's just that someone ends up paying to subsidize the units. And sometimes that's the public sector through a tax abatement, but sometimes it can be through bonuses, which is why in the past, and this may be changing at city planning, a very strong argument from past legal counsel at city planning was, we can't mandate affordable housing unless we have a zoning change tied to it. You probably all realized this in the past. That's what was the heavy argument by their own legal counsel. So they were very careful because they were careful of being sued on a takings. And in the past, 30%, they were very wary of requiring that without some density bonus or without some 421, some equivalency program. If it was higher than, if it was getting more higher than 10%. We've also seen other analyses by, actually, this one was not in the city of New York, but in Yonkers on high-rise buildings by HRNA. And they gave a very good presentation to the city of Yonkers Council on the different cost elements that go into increasing the percentage of affordability from 10% to 20%. And you're talking, Paul, you're talking 30% here. So that's a very substantial percentage on a new building without some density bonus or without some tax abatement or without some outright grant money for affordable housing. I think most of the development community would have a very hard time cross-subsidizing it within their own, within their own building. That's what we found anyway. I'm speaking here as someone who, in my younger career in public sector, I worked for Ed Logue at UDC. That's what we did. We built affordable housing. And so I got very used to this, being careful about, difference between stick-built developments in the suburbs and cost of building here in the city. And, we were relying heavily on most of our projects with the old federal 236 programs, that kind of thing. There was some program involved to allow us to do that.
Great. Thanks. David Solnick.
Yeah, kind of a follow up on the economics. It sounds like you're primarily looking to the developer to tell you whether they can afford, how much affordable housing they can afford. And obviously that's a little bit the fox in the hen house. Is there a mechanism, a more objective financial analysis that can be done on a case-by-case basis, a building-by-building basis? Because as you've pointed out, the costs associated with each building, the conversion of each building are very, very different from building to building. It seems to me that there might be a mechanism to incorporate that into a zoning change, into allowing these, a regulation that allows these conversions and maybe subsidizes them, but only if there's some independent audit, some independent documentation that establishes what would be an affordability percentage. So
Yeah.
could you speak to how that might be done?
Well, I would cite this, to my knowledge, has not been done actually in New York City so far, in terms of what you're asking. The most recent experience I had was the city of Yonkers, where the city council itself wanted to raise the number of units that would be affordable from 10%, which they were using 6%. In certain cases where the median income of the affordability was low, I think it was 60% of median income versus 80%. And for 80% of median income, they were using 10% of the units to be affordable. So what they did is they hired HRNA, who you're probably all familiar with, to do a sensitivity analysis on that. So they hired their own consultant. So this would not be the fox in the hen house example. This would be the public sector actually using their own financial people to do that analysis. Now, could they do it? In this case, H&R RNA was doing it on a citywide level in the city of Yonkers rather than a case-by-case level. Could you theoretically do a case-by-case? You could, but you would need to get, it would be more expensive, obviously, to do, because you'd have many buildings that you actually, any building coming in, you'd have to have a separate, it would be like a, it'd be like the cost of doing an EAS, an environmental assessment statement. You'd be doing a financial assessment. You could do that. I don't see any, I see any.
It's exactly what the developer is doing in-house.
It's what the developer is doing in-house. That's right. That's correct. And, it's just that by our experience of working for some of them, and I don't want to overstretch this because I find there's so many differences with what they expect, but on the RXR model that we were working on, we found that, going above the 10% started to eat in so much to the financial pro forma that without some externality, by that I mean a grant, loans, a low interest loan, or some type of tax abatement or a pilot. I hate to mention that.
I don't see how you could set a number. I mean, there's going to be radically different costs associated with different buildings,
There is, that's right.
Depending on their wedding cake, it's just whether they're elevators. I mean, they're just gargantuan differences. So the idea of setting a single percentage for an entire district just seems, it just seems to make no sense.
And that's why you have, and then essentially though, that's what, what was mentioned earlier is the city has set some guidelines, or, if you're doing 30% affordable in a building, that may not work for a significant number of buildings because of the differences in cost. It's possible it could work for some buildings, but I think it doesn't work for most. And so to your point, I don't disagree with that. I mean, there are differences in buildings. There are differences in, what the development expectations are and the amount of risk someone's willing to take.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks. Have you feel good, Dave? So thanks. Carrie.
Yeah, thanks. So based on everything you just said, I'm still left with the question of why would a change in zoning increase affordable housing? It almost seems unsurmountable.
Well, I'm not sure it's insurmountable, but what I've said down at city planning and to council people is, well, first you have to allow it. I mean, you got to open the door, and that's a zoning change. And now you want to open the door with knowledge also that something's going to work. So first, if you open the door to the housing, market rate housing, that's the first question. Would the development community respond? And our sense is they will respond if they had something like 421G. What Lower Manhattan says historically is that response will then be fairly significant. Now in Lower Manhattan, they did not at the time get into affordable housing. Now you add affordable housing to it, you've got to look at some mechanism to help, I think, make that financial pro forma work better. If you're looking at 20 or 30% affordable housing, there's got to be somebody paying for that. The market itself rarely pays for that, unless there's a certain situation where you get the perfect wedding cake building and the conversion makes sense, and there could be that example because the buildings do vary, as was mentioned earlier. So I don't think there's a magic bullet, but I think looking at significant amounts of affordable housing, you've got to look at either a density, some type of financial incentive that makes that possible. Otherwise, you're expecting the development community to buy a building at per square foot price that buildings are going for, but then to lose money on 20 or 30% of the units. That financial pro forma usually doesn't work. So
So a zoning change would simply be more units to try to offset the cost of the
Well,
affordable units?
I think there's different, I don't want to say there's just one way to do this. For instance, the different ways I've seen are once you're, higher than something like 10% and of the units being affordable, let's say 80% of median income, something that's reasonable. Let's take a developer. Well, we used to work for a couple of large developers doing their market studies. And it was the old 80-20 program. It's a tax program of the federal government. That's a tax credit for the developer. I mean, this is Steve Ross or someone like that, You get a tax credit of 20% by the feds. It's a credit. It's not a deduction on your income taxes. So you can use that credit to offset your other income. That's very attractive. And that is what drives affordable housing at 20% in the buildings we've seen in New York City, that housing tax credit still exists. The same thing with historic buildings. It's the historic tax credit that's driving the preservation of those buildings more than anything else. So you do have those programs out there, those tax credit programs that could make a 20% affordable building feasible if they can get that tax credit. And some of these developers are, they have other income that they're trying to shelter. So it does get complicated. And so I think the first thing to do is actually allow housing. Right now, nobody's can do anything as actually allow housing with the zoning. But I think where you're looking at, I would say more of a large amount of affordable housing. To do that, you need to look at some tax incentives, such as the federal tax credit, and that exists now, or real estate tax credit, which is the old 421G, or simple straight out pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, or you've got programs in Albany that are, from the affordable housing people in Albany, where you can get outright grants or low interest loans. So there's because there has to be some way to subsidize some way the affordable housing, because by definition, it's being set at limits that the market can't pay, or the market is not going to pay for. So I know this is not a satisfactory answer, probably because it does get kind of complicated, and you can't, I think it's dangerous to do something that, or to require something that with some knowledge, which, city planning has, that has proven not to work in the past. So if you ask for too much from the private development community, they're simply not going to respond, because there's, investors can invest elsewhere. So there's got to be a financial sense that where you're doing more affordable. There's no magic to the 10%, but 10% has worked in a lot of other places without other externalities. But if you're looking for 20 or 30% affordability, there's got to be some externality there to allow the developer to actually make the financial pro forma work, or they're not going to respond.
You good, Kerry? Thanks. Just want to do a time check. We have 7 minutes left. I see David Solnick's hand up and Lowell Kern's hand up. So I'll go to them as group members, and then I see David Hallock and Chris LeBron. But let's be conscious of time, please. David Solnick.
Yeah, I want to somewhat take issue, but you are kind of fixed on this 10% number because it's what's worked. But these conversions, one of the subsidies that you mentioned was density bonus. Well, a lot of these buildings already have a density bonus.
They don't need it. You're right.
They're already way above 12. So,
correct.
So it shouldn't be an absolute fixed thing that the developers can't afford it. I don't know whether they can or cannot. I'm not in the business of assuming they can afford 30%. I'm not in the business of assuming they cannot. It's all in the data. It's all in the numbers. But the other thing about those numbers is when a developer, when a building goes on the market, its price is based on what people can do with it. I mean, given that these buildings
Yes,
are empty, you know, are half empty, their value as office buildings is way down. And
yes,
so the price that they will pay for that building will end up being commensurate with what they can make some money on. And so it's a chicken and egg problem. It isn't simply it's going to go on the market for 50 million and you can either afford affordable housing with that number or you can't. That's not how it works. If it's going to go on the market and it's going to sell for what the zoning allows you to build, and if the zoning includes 20% affordable, then that will be reflected in the purchase price of that building. So this isn't something that's fixed in stone and then gets, you know, and then developers, you know, it's much more malleable than you're presenting, I would say.
Great point, David. Thank you. Lowell.
Yeah, Frank, you seem to be, if I'm following you correctly, the fact that we can get 30% affordable housing on new buildings seems remarkable because you're saying that the pro formas don't usually work at that kind of level. Or is that just for a new building versus a conversion? Because we
Yeah.
get 30% routinely now.
well, that's terrific. That's terrific. And I agree with what was just said by David, that, you know, some buildings, the buildings differ on the conversions. Some are going to be more costly than others. So it's hard to come up with one sort of point of reference because the buildings are going to vary in the cost to convert. So if you set one standard for them, you know, almost by definition, then you're going to limit the universe of how many conversions you'll get. I'm not saying you won't get them though. You'll get some on the buildings that are more feasible to do and where physical construction costs of conversion are less and where you're already able to maximize, you know, utilize the existing FAR, which is
Okay.
higher than 12 in many cases.
All right, so let me follow up with you on that. Using just the Garment District area, you said most of these are older pre-61 buildings. Are those going to be cheaper to convert than, say, converting a high-rise in Midtown where the windows don't open?
By the way, we think there's, and by the way, I'm not, you know, either a structural engineer or an architect. So I've relied a little bit on the Perkins guys telling me that in some of these conversions, yes, it's easier to convert some of these buildings than some of these more 1960s, 70s office buildings with significant floor plates. There's no way to get interior units. So, you know, I think, again, it does depend very much on the building itself, on the conversion possibilities.
Right, because I'm thinking, you know, you've heard from some of the members here that, you know, the affordability thing is something that would incentivize us to get behind the conversions.
Right.
But, you know, from what you're saying, that financially that becomes more difficult in certain buildings. For something like the Garment District, where they're older buildings and you've got increased FAR because it's pre-61 and the buildings are easier to convert, smaller floor plates, windows that may open, we could mandate, or at least theoretically, we could ask for a higher affordability component in buildings like that and, you know, make it more difficult to convert, you know, the more difficult to convert buildings we could leave alone. Would that be something that you think the real estate industry would be interested in?
The problem is going to be setting and by the way, we mentioned earlier, I think it was David who mentioned it, that if you had an outside fiscal analysis of the buildings, that would be able to give you some idea of the buildings that are going to cost a lot more to convert. and those that are, easier to convert, and therefore you could get a higher percentage of affordable housing on. I think there's not an easy one size fits all here to the conversions. So it is a little bit hard to set, a standard for it. But I do think, I think the attitude at city planning is that all of these conversions should have an affordable, part of them. And therein lies the difficulty. How much? And
Right.
does it vary by type of building?
The problem is either Albany or city council tends to be a very blunt object, and they can't
Yes.
cater this to what the kind of thing we're talking about. So how do we get around that, with legislation that needs to be fine tuned?
Yeah. And
That's where I think the problem becomes.
Yeah. And one simple thing I could say to that is it was clear to me anyway, and I think to many others, that one of the key reasons that the governor's housing compact failed is that whoever was writing it didn't have the necessary experience on the ground as to what worked and what didn't. They were cutting and pasting from states like Massachusetts and California, and it's got to be fine-tuned more than that. And I think here our advantage in the city, though, is you do have a lot of people who have, good knowledge of this. People who worked at city planning, some of the law firms, some of the planning firms. So if they can spend a little bit of time, which I think the city's willing to do, they can fine tune this a little bit better than what the housing compact was at the state level. I think that was a good lesson in how not to do things. One, there was no education, to it. They tried to do this in literally 4 months. They announced this in January with no public input, no discussion with anybody. And they did it with the wrong, I'm just be blunt about it. They did it with a blunt instrument, that was easily criticized.
So Frank, you're echoing the purpose of this working group. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I do want to do a time check that it is after 5. We're beyond our hour. Frank, if you have a couple of more minutes, we have 2 board members who
Paul,
have
if I may, I really have to, I've got an evening meeting I've got to go to. If you don't mind my signing off, I'd like to. In other words, I've got to be at a meeting at 5:30. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's understandable. We asked you for an hour and you gave it to us very generously. We appreciate that. So we can thank you.
Thank you.
I can stay on longer. We can continue this conversation with other working group members and other board members.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time, Frank.
Yeah, thank you. I hope it was helpful
to us.
Okay.
I think it was.
Yeah. All right. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye now.
Yeah.
Okay. So David, before we go to the questions, and I see David's hand up and Chris's hand up. I know that Carrie had a hard stop at 5 o'clock. I don't know if other working group members had the same hard stop. So before we continue this dialogue, and I can stay longer, so we can continue the dialogue on, but I just want working group members to try to take away from today's conversation, where do we stand on commercial conversions in terms of high density, and what framework would we want to put this into? In email communications, there's been a range of questions to think about to prod us to come up with sort of a position. At our last meeting, there wasn't a consensus on where we stood on this. And so I'd like to have working group members send me emails with their thoughts about where do we stand on commercial conversions? How do we feel about it being higher density than 12 FAR? What things would we want to make sure we insist upon? How would we expand upon or just copy the Hell's Kitchen Land Use Meeting letter to the Garment District Alliance on the proposed zoning text amendment on conversion of spaces? So if all of you could just do a little bit of homework on that, that would be helpful. So I know some of you have to sign off, so but I want to continue this conversation going. I can stay for about another 10 minutes. So David Holoka.
Yeah, I mean, there was a question I was going to ask Frank, and maybe some of you who listen better can answer it. But he seemed to say that it wasn't economical for developers to have more than 10% inclusionary housing he at one point seemed to say that if the FAR cap was lifted,
David, freeze up on me.
that somehow that might change. I just wanted to understand how scaling up in the way that lifting the FAR cap of 12 would allow might make the percentage of inclusionary housing rise and still have the project be desirable for a developer. You know, whether there's an economy of scale. I don't know if anyone else, you know, took away something from that could answer the question. And I think it applies both to existing buildings that might be converted and to new construction, because in theory, an existing building, commercial building to be converted could be limited to a 12 FAR for the residential component. And my guess is that in the converting the McGraw Hill building, where the lower, larger floors were kept commercial and the upper floors were made residential, it probably fit within that FAR. It must have. So in theory, in these garment center buildings, we could be converting them largely to residential, maybe on the upper, smaller floors, and keep commercial on the lower floors. We're still looking to get some affordable housing within those buildings. And if that percentage of residential that could be built, sort of lifting the FAR cap of 12 within the building, could allow us to build more affordable. That's what I'm trying to find out. How would that work? And does simply scaling up the whole equation, whether it's a 70-30 building, an 80-20 or a 90-10, how does that make it more desirable for a developer to include affordable housing? And I wish Frank was here to answer that. I think it's kind of what...
I see David Solnick's hand and Barnett's hand going up, so perhaps they want to answer. Are you raising your hand to answer the question, David?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
I mean, I think the answer, unfortunately, the answer to the question is two words. It depends. There's a huge difference, as you know, David, I'm sure, that between new construction and existing construction. New construction, the costs are quite predictable. Your construction costs are quite predictable, relatively predictable. In existing construction, and particularly in a use conversion, they're not at all predictable on just a cost per square foot. They're extremely dependent on building to building, and given the constraints on a conversion to residential with floor plate sizes, with whether a building needs to be cored or not, whether it's old or whether it's new, there just is not a way to answer the question that you're asking, except on a case-by-case basis. It's just not doable.
Right, Bobby, do you want to?
But the question is really, what does the 12 FAR cap have to do with it?
Well, the 12 FAR cap has a lot to, I mean, I don't really understand the argument for limiting the FAR on an existing building. It's not going to make the building smaller, and it's not going to make it bigger. It's going to stay exactly the same size as it has been for 50 years. So I don't really understand the relevance of the FAR cap on existing conversions. It just makes no sense to me. I do understand the desire to leverage those higher FARs for greater affordability. And I think
that's what I'm getting at.
So Bobby,
where we should be, where our attention should be directed. But not to lowering the FAR. It doesn't make the building smaller.
Bobby?
So I just want to add that presently, like within the zoning resolution for the city, for conversions specifically, there's the preservation of floor area for buildings occupied prior to 1969. So most of, at least my understanding of, and it's also within the adaptive reuse task force report as well. And so that many of the conversions that that the garment district may be interested in would be able to be, they would be able to preserve the floor area. That does not mean that there aren't other additional regulatory items that would make sense to put forth in a text amendment or another land use review process, but those are preserved. To David's point about the conversions versus new construction, I wholeheartedly agree. I do think a great example of, like, for new construction, like a density bonus that I at least remember is there is that PFAS building on I think it's 8th Avenue in Chelsea. and it received a, I guess, subsidy from the HPD program for the senior housing, and also received a density bonus of, I think it may have been an additional 1.5 FAR or something close to that. And that made it more financeable to add these additional units. It is by giving developers additional floor area, it's a form of a subsidy, or it could be considered a form of a subsidy, whether that has to be, above, given that, most of the community district does not have existing floor area ratio requirements. Even at 10, it may not make sense to go to 12. It may make sense to go to 12. I'm not saying one way or the other, but density bonuses exist whether or not there is a lifting of the 12.0 residential FAR cap.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go to Chris LeBron next as a member of the board, and then Gregory, and then I'm going to have to call it stop to the meeting. So, Chris.
Thank you, Paul. I would ask the task force here, this working group here, to look at Glenwood Management and do some research there. Glenwood Management in 2014 to 2016 were under investigation from the Southern District, New York, because of their misuse in a pay-for-play scheme for 421A tax abatements. As the New York Times began to dig deeper into 421A along with this Glenwood Management case, they found that most of the 20% affordable housing in the 80-20 model vanished after about 3 years. The apartments were successfully warehoused. Most of the management companies did not report leasing to the state, and records of those affordable houses were deleted by the state after 3 years, which is the warehouse problem that we have. So if we're going to consider conversion of unused corporate buildings right now, I think we need to, one, ask for the appropriate measures to track affordable housing that is being created in these conversions, and then also to dive deep into how a program like 421A and even J51 tax credits are being misused. Because in this particular neighborhood, as well as New York, I was reading an Aaron Carr piece about a year ago or so. I think 1 in every 3 market value apartments in New York City probably belong within the rent stabilized realm. They were just successfully warehoused when they were turned into Airbnbs or not rented or not reported to the state, and it become market value apartments. So part of the work that we need to do is make sure that there's political will within our elected officials to create a program of substance to track our current affordable housing and future affordable housing that we get from this conversion. So it would just
Thanks,
please
Chris.
consider that moving forward.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Good thought. Gregory McCosco, your hand has been up for a while, and I appreciate your patience today.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to ask a question from a bigger standpoint. We're talking about new housing of whatever nature. I think the end game at some point, there's going to be more living space in our community. And my question is with regard to density. Given that the Garment District is 50% occupied, at some point that occupation is going to go up, and there'll be apartments of some kind, is my guess. Is there any looking at the bigger picture? In other words, the density of new buildings going up. And I ask the question most particularly with regard to the new hotel that is in the process of being built at 45th and 8th Avenue. And if buildings like that go into the neighborhood, that's going to increase the density and just the traffic and everything else. And from the standpoint of the community, I wonder, is there any discussion overall on that score relative to just basically keeping the community within reasonable traffic issues, et cetera?
Thanks, Rory. That's a great question. I want to be careful, though, about the way we define density. Density in this situation, when we're talking about floor area ratio, is about the floor area that's consumed, not by the number of units per floor. So hotel density, where you have many rooms, is a different sort of density discussion than the amount of floor area consumed in construction. So just let's be careful of that distinction. But that's a great point to raise, so thank you.
But if I may follow up, in other words, the number of hotel rooms, in other words, it all depends upon what the FAR is allowed on that particular building or any hotel building, and is that the case?
Bobby, did you want to pipe in on that? Was why your hand went up?
Yeah, I did just want to add that if there is a change in density versus what is allowable by right, or a change in use, there will be a public land use review process. Furthermore, with some of these larger buildings, they're typically subject to a form of environmental review in which you would have an assessment of their impacts on things like traffic, other congestion, schools, you name it. I think there's a pretty robust public process for input there. And I think is certainly a thing that the community board is concerned with and takes very seriously.
Right.
It's my understanding
and to go back to an example of that, let's say you have a 2,000 square foot floor plan, right? Under this conversation of FAR, that's the same density, whether you have 4 500 square foot apartments or you have 20 100 square foot hotel rooms, right? Like that's the same density, even though it sounds when you talk about hotel rooms. So I just want to be careful about the way we're defining density. All right. High density hotel, like high population, human density is different than floor area density. All right. So I just want to be cognizant of that distinction. All right. I don't see other hands up. David and Pamela, if you want to hang on for a second. David Halowka and Pamela, you two want to hang on for a minute. And everybody else, thank you all very much. It's a very productive meeting. Next meeting is on the 18th. Where we're going to focus on, much like today, we focused on the economics of commercial conversion. We're going to look at the economics of building affordable housing. And that will be the main thrust of our meeting on the 18th. So I look forward to seeing everybody back here then.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Enjoy the weather.